The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Detective Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. He had been patrolling this upscale neighborhood for nearly 2 years, and something about today felt different. The radio crackled with routine calls, but his attention was drawn to a sleek black sedan that had just turned onto Maple Avenue. Sarah Williams gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as she noticed the police cruiser behind her. She had been driving to her law office early that morning, reviewing mental notes for the discrimination case she would be arguing later that week. As one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys, she had seen too many situations like this before, but experiencing it firsthand still sent a familiar knot of tension through her stomach. Rodriguez found himself following the sedan without any particular reason. The car wasn't speeding, the license plate was clearly visible, and there were no obvious violations. Yet something compelled him to stay behind the vehicle. He told himself it was routine patrol work, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the car didn't belong in this neighborhood. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant reminding her about the morning meeting with potential clients. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard and realized she was actually running ahead of schedule. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being followed while heading to meet a family who claimed their son had been racially profiled by local police. The detective's training had taught him to trust his instincts, but those same instincts had been shaped by years of assumptions and unconscious biases. He noticed the car was moving slowly, almost deliberately, and wondered if the driver was looking for something. In his mind, he began constructing a narrative about suspicious behavior, despite the complete lack of evidence to support such thinking. Sarah approached a red light. She used the opportunity to check her makeup in the rearview mirror. She had learned long ago that presentation mattered, especially as a black woman in a courtroom. Her tailored navy suit was pressed perfectly, her briefcase sat neatly on the passenger seat, and her law degree hung proudly in her downtown office. But none of that seemed to matter when she was simply driving through a neighborhood where she supposedly didn't belong. Rodriguez decided to run the license plate, telling himself it was standard procedure. The results came back immediately, showing the vehicle was registered to Sarah Williams with a clean driving record and no outstanding warrants. The address listed was actually in an even more affluent neighborhood across town. Still, he found reasons to remain suspicious. The light turned green, and Sarah continued driving at exactly the speed limit. She had learned this defensive driving technique years ago from her father, who had given her the talk that many black parents felt obligated to give their children about interactions with law enforcement. Keep your hands visible, speak respectfully, don't make sudden movements, and never give them a reason to escalate the situation. After following for several more blocks, Rodriguez made the decision that would change both of their mornings dramatically. He activated his emergency lights and signaled for the sedan to pull over. In his radio call to dispatch, he reported stopping a suspicious vehicle for erratic driving behavior, despite the fact that Sarah had committed no traffic violations whatsoever. Sarah's heart sank as she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She carefully pulled over to the curb, turned off her engine, and placed her hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. Years of legal training kicked in as she began mentally preparing for what she knew could be a challenging interaction. She thought about her clients who had experienced similar situations, and how she had advised them to remain calm and compliant while documenting everything that happened. The detective approached the vehicle with his hand resting casually on his duty belt. He had already decided that this was likely a case of someone being where they didn't belong, possibly looking for houses to burglarize or cars to steal. The nice car and professional appearance didn't immediately register as inconsistent with his assumptions. As Rodriguez reached the driver's side window, Sarah rolled it down and kept her hands visible. "Good morning, officer," she said in a calm, professional tone that she had perfected in countless courtroom appearances. "May I ask why you stopped me today?" The question caught Rodriguez slightly off guard. Most people he stopped seemed nervous or defensive, but this woman spoke with a confidence that suggested she was genuinely curious about his reasoning rather than afraid of the consequences. He found himself struggling to articulate exactly why he had initiated the stop. "I noticed some erratic driving behavior," he said. immediately realizing how weak that sounded given that he couldn't specify what exactly had been erratic about her driving. "Can I see your license and registration, please?" Sarah reached slowly for her purse, narrating her movements as she did so. "I'm reaching for my wallet now, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment." As she handed over her documents, she noticed the detective's nameplate read Rodriguez and made a mental note of his badge number. Rodriguez examined the license, noting the address in Hillcrest Manor, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. The registration matched and everything appeared to be in order. Yet he found himself looking for additional reasons to justify the stop. The cognitive dissonance between his assumptions and the evidence in front of him created an uncomfortable tension that he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Sarah waited patiently as the officer reviewed her documents. She had been in situations like this before, both personally and professionally, and she knew that patience and professionalism were her best strategies. However, she also knew that this interaction was likely being recorded by the officer's body camera, and she was already thinking about how this incident might be relevant to her current caseload. The morning that had started so routinely for both individuals was about to become much more complicated, with consequences that neither of them could have anticipated when they first encountered each other on that quiet suburban street. Detective Rodriguez stood beside Sarah's car, holding her license and registration while trying to formulate his next move. The documents clearly showed everything was legitimate, but he felt committed to the stop now and needed to justify his actions. He decided to expand his questioning, hoping to find something that would validate his initial suspicions. "Ms. Williams," he said, reading from her license, "what brings you to this neighborhood this morning?" The question was phrased as casual conversation, but Sarah immediately recognized it as an attempt to establish whether she belonged in the area. Sarah maintained her composed demeanor while considering her response carefully. As an attorney, she knew she wasn't legally required to answer questions about her destination or purpose for being in any public area. However, she also understood that being confrontational at this stage would likely escalate the situation unnecessarily. "I'm heading to my office downtown," she replied truthfully. "I often take this route because it's less congested than the main highways during rush hour." She gestured toward her briefcase on the passenger seat, which was clearly visible through the window. Rodriguez glanced at the briefcase but didn't seem satisfied with her explanation. In his experience, people who belonged in neighborhoods like this didn't drive through them as shortcuts. They lived there or had legitimate business there. The fact that she was just passing through seemed to confirm his suspicions about her being out of place. "Are you familiar with this area?" he continued, his questioning becoming more pointed. "Have you had any previous contact with residents or businesses here?" The line of questioning was making Sarah increasingly uncomfortable, not because she had anything to hide, but because she recognized the pattern. She had represented numerous clients who had described almost identical interactions with police officers who seemed determined to establish that they didn't belong in certain neighborhoods. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, reading his nameplate, "I appreciate that you're doing your job, but I'm curious about what specific traffic violation prompted this stop. I've been driving for over 15 years without any accidents or major violations, and I'm confident I was following all traffic laws this morning." The direct challenge to his authority caught Rodriguez off guard. Most people he stopped either became defensive and argumentative or compliant and apologetic. Sarah's approach was different. She was questioning his actions in a way that suggested she understood her rights, but wasn't being disrespectful about asserting them. "As I mentioned, I observed erratic driving behavior," he repeated. But even as he said it, he realized he couldn't specify exactly what that behavior had been. The truth was that her driving had been completely normal, and he was beginning to understand that his suspicions had been based on assumptions rather than observations. Sarah decided to press the issue slightly further. "Could you be more specific about what you observed?" "I keep a clean driving record because my profession requires it, so I'm genuinely concerned if I'm doing something wrong without realizing it." The mention of her profession piqued Rodriguez's curiosity. He looked at her more carefully, taking in her professional attire and articulate speech pattern. She didn't fit the profile he had constructed in his mind, but he wasn't ready to abandon his initial assessment entirely. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked, genuinely curious now but still maintaining his authoritative stance. "I'm an attorney," Sarah replied simply, watching for his reaction. "I specialize in civil rights law, actually. I spend a lot of time working on cases involving police-community relations." The revelation hit Rodriguez like a cold splash of water. An attorney. Not just any attorney, but one who specialized in the exact type of case that could arise from situations like this. He felt his confidence in the stop beginning to crumble, but pride and the need to save face prevented him from immediately acknowledging his mistake. "Civil rights law," he repeated, trying to process this new information. "That's interesting work, I'm sure." Sarah nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor while internally noting how the officer's tone had subtly shifted upon learning her occupation. "It is. I find it particularly rewarding to help people who feel they've been treated unfairly by institutions they should be able to trust." The comment was pointed but not accusatory, and Rodriguez understood the implication immediately. He was faced with a choice. He could continue down the path he had started, potentially creating a situation that could have serious professional consequences, or he could find a way to gracefully conclude the stop. "Well, your documents appear to be in order," he said, handing them back through the window. But instead of ending the encounter there, he made another decision that would further complicate the situation. "Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" Sarah's professional training kicked in immediately. She knew that she could decline this request, as there was no legal basis for requiring her to exit the vehicle during a routine traffic stop unless the officer had reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. However, she also knew that refusing could escalate the situation and potentially put her in physical danger. "May I ask why that's necessary?" she inquired politely but firmly. "I've provided my license and registration as requested, and you've indicated they're in order." Rodriguez found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He had no legitimate reason to ask her to exit the vehicle, but he felt like he needed to assert his authority somehow. The fact that she was questioning his requests in such a knowledgeable way was making him defensive. "It's standard procedure," he said, which was not entirely true. Vehicle exits were typically requested only when officers had specific safety concerns or reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Sarah recognized the weak justification for what it was. She had heard similar explanations in depositions and court testimony countless times. She also knew that this moment was likely being recorded by the officer's body camera, which could be crucial evidence if this situation continued to deteriorate. "Officer Rodriguez, I want to cooperate with you, but I also want to understand my rights in this situation. As an attorney, I'm sure you can appreciate that I need to be careful about how I handle interactions that could potentially become legal matters." The statement was carefully crafted to remind him of her professional status, while also suggesting that she understood this interaction could have legal ramifications. It was a subtle warning, delivered in the most professional tone possible. Rodriguez paused, realizing that he was at a crossroads. Every decision he made from this point forward would be scrutinized if this incident became the subject of a complaint or lawsuit. The woman sitting in front of him was clearly intelligent, professional, and knowledgeable about her rights. She was also, he was beginning to realize, probably innocent of any wrongdoing. The morning sun had risen higher, and other residents in the neighborhood were beginning to start their day. A few people walking their dogs had noticed the traffic stop and were observing from a distance. Rodriguez became aware that this interaction was no longer private, adding another layer of pressure to an already tense situation. The growing audience of neighborhood residents made Rodriguez acutely aware that his handling of this situation would likely become neighborhood gossip within hours. He could see Mrs. Henderson from the corner house pretending to water her flowers, while obviously watching the interaction. Tom Bradley had stopped his morning jog and was stretching nearby, clearly listening to every word he could catch. Sarah noticed the gathering attention as well, but her reaction was quite different. As someone who had spent years advocating for transparency in police interactions, she understood that witnesses could be valuable if this situation escalated inappropriately. However, She also knew that the presence of observers might make the officer feel pressured to demonstrate his authority rather than de-escalate. "Officer, I understand you have a job to do," Sarah said carefully. "But I'm concerned that this stop may be based on assumptions rather than any actual violation of law. I'd like to resolve this situation as quickly and professionally as possible, so we can both get on with our day." Rodriguez felt trapped between his pride and his growing realization that he had made a significant error in judgment. The professional way Sarah was handling the situation only highlighted how unreasonable his actions were beginning to appear. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested, and that every word he spoke was being evaluated by someone who understood the legal system far better than most people he encountered. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to be patient while I complete my investigation," he said, trying to reassert control over the situation. But even as he spoke, he realized that calling it an investigation was an overreach. There was nothing to investigate beyond his own poor decision-making. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her law partner, probably wondering why she was running late for their morning meeting. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was being detained by a police officer while her clients, who had experienced similar treatment, were waiting to discuss their case with her. "What exactly are you investigating, Officer Rodriguez?" she asked, her tone remaining respectful but becoming more pointed. "I've provided you with all requested documentation, which you've verified as legitimate. I haven't committed any traffic violations that you've been able to specify. At what point does this stop become harassment rather than law enforcement?" The word harassment hung in the air between them like a challenge. Rodriguez knew that if this incident were reviewed by his supervisors, that would be exactly the question they would ask. What had started as what he thought was proactive policing was beginning to look like exactly the kind of behavior that had landed his department in hot water before. Mrs. Henderson had abandoned any pretense of gardening and was now standing at her fence, openly watching the interaction. She pulled out her phone, and Rodriguez realized she might be recording the encounter. The thought sent a chill through him as he imagined this video being shared on social media or, worse yet, being used as evidence in a civil rights lawsuit. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to put the phone away," Rodriguez called out to Mrs. Henderson, but she simply shook her head. "This is a public street, officer," Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. "I have every right to record what I can see from my own property." Sarah turned slightly to see who had spoken and felt a small surge of gratitude. She had often told her clients that witness testimony could be crucial in cases of police misconduct, but she had never expected to benefit from such testimony herself. Rodriguez realized that his situation was deteriorating rapidly. Not only was he detaining an attorney without cause, but he was now being recorded by a citizen who clearly understood her rights. He needed to find a way to end this encounter before it became an even bigger problem. "Look, Ms. Williams," he said, his tone becoming more conciliatory. "I apologize if this has been inconvenient. I was just being thorough in my patrol duties." Sarah recognized the subtle shift in his approach and understood that he was beginning to realize the gravity of his mistake. However, she also knew that this was exactly the kind of situation that needed to be addressed properly, rather than simply brushed aside with a quick apology. "I appreciate that, Officer Rodriguez. But I need to understand what patrol duty requires you to stop law-abiding citizens who are simply driving through a neighborhood. This is exactly the kind of interaction that erodes trust between police and community members." Her response was measured and professional, but it carried the weight of her experience representing clients who had been in similar situations. She wasn't angry or confrontational, but she was making it clear that this interaction was problematic and couldn't simply be dismissed. Tom Bradley, the jogger, had moved closer and was now within earshot of the conversation. Rodriguez noticed that he too had pulled out his phone and appeared to be recording. The officer felt surrounded and overwhelmed by the attention his simple traffic stop had generated. "Sir, I need you to move along," Rodriguez said to Tom, his voice carrying more authority than he actually felt at the moment. "I'm on a public sidewalk, officer," Tom replied calmly. "I'm not interfering with your duties, just exercising my right to be present in a public space." Sarah could see that the officer was becoming increasingly agitated by the presence of witnesses, which concerned her. She had seen too many situations escalate when officers felt cornered or embarrassed in front of observers. Her priority was de-escalating the situation, while also ensuring that her rights were protected. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, drawing his attention back to her. "I understand that patrol work can be challenging, and I genuinely appreciate the difficult job that law enforcement officers do every day. However, I think we both know that this stop lacks legal justification, and I'd like to resolve this professionally." The statement was crafted to give him an opportunity to save face while also making it clear that she understood her rights and wouldn't simply accept harassment. She was offering him a path to end the encounter gracefully, but she was also making it clear that she wouldn't be intimidated or pushed around. Rodriguez looked at Sarah, then at the growing number of observers, then back at Sarah. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, and he knew that every second he prolonged this interaction was making his situation worse. The attorney sitting in front of him was clearly intelligent, professional, and knowledgeable about her rights. The witnesses were recording everything. His supervisors would definitely hear about this incident. The morning that had started with what he thought was routine patrol work had turned into exactly the kind of situation that could define the rest of his career, and not in a good way. Rodriguez's radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the scene. "Unit 47, what's your status on the traffic stop?" The dispatcher's voice was routine, but it reminded everyone present that this interaction was being monitored and documented through official channels. Sarah heard the radio call and realized that the stop had been going on long enough for dispatch to check on its status. In her experience representing clients in similar situations, she knew that prolonged traffic stops without clear justification could be evidence of harassment or racial profiling. "Unit 47 responding," Rodriguez said into his radio, stepping slightly away from Sarah's car. "Still conducting the traffic stop, we'll update shortly." His voice carried less confidence than his words suggested, and he avoided making eye contact with Sarah as he spoke. Mrs. Henderson had now been joined by her neighbor, Mr. Peterson, and both were watching the interaction with obvious concern. Peterson, a retired teacher, had seen enough interactions between police and community members to recognize when something wasn't right. "That woman hasn't done anything wrong," Peterson said quietly to Mrs. Henderson, but loudly enough for Rodriguez to hear. "She's been nothing but polite and cooperative this whole time." Sarah appreciated the support from the neighbors, but she was also concerned about how Rodriguez might react to what could be perceived as community pressure. She had seen officers become more aggressive when they felt challenged by crowds, even peaceful ones. "Officer Rodriguez," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and professional, "I have a meeting at my office that I really need to get to. Since you verified my documentation and I haven't committed any traffic violations, could we please conclude this stop?" Rodriguez knew he was at a decision point. He could continue the stop and try to find some justification for his actions, which would likely make the situation worse and potentially result in formal complaints or lawsuits. Alternatively, he could acknowledge that the stop lacked merit and allow Sarah to continue on her way. The problem was that his pride was making it difficult to admit that he had been wrong. In his mind, he was a good officer who was just doing his job. The idea that he might have racially profiled someone went against his self-image and was difficult to accept. "Ma'am, I need to complete my report on this incident," he said, which was both true and a stalling tactic. Every traffic stop required documentation, but a simple warning or verbal counseling could be documented quickly and easily. Sarah recognized the delay tactic for what it was. She had seen similar behavior from officers who were trying to justify stops that shouldn't have happened in the first place. The longer he prolonged the interaction, the more likely it became that something would happen to escalate the situation. "What exactly will your report say about the reason for this stop?" Sarah asked, her legal training evident in the precision of her question. "I'm asking because, as I mentioned, I keep detailed records of any interactions that might be relevant to my work, and I want to make sure I understand what's being documented." The question put Rodriguez in an uncomfortable position, because it forced him to articulate exactly what he would put in writing about his justification for the stop. He would have to either admit that he had no legitimate reason, or create a false narrative that could be challenged if this became the subject of legal action. Tom Bradley, still recording from the sidewalk, spoke up again. "Officer, I've been watching this whole interaction, and I haven't seen this lady do anything wrong. She's been respectful and cooperative the entire time." "Sir, I need you to mind your own business," Rodriguez snapped, his frustration with the situation beginning to show. The presence of witnesses was making him defensive, and his professional demeanor was starting to slip. Sarah immediately recognized the warning signs of an officer who was losing control of his emotions. She had trained other attorneys to watch for exactly these behaviors, because they often preceded more serious escalations. "Officer Rodriguez," she said firmly but respectfully, "I think we're all just trying to understand what's happening here. These neighbors aren't interfering with your work. They're just concerned community members who want to see everyone treated fairly." Her intervention was designed to de-escalate the tension between Rodriguez and the witnesses, while also subtly reminding him that his behavior was being observed and evaluated by multiple people. Rodriguez took a deep breath and tried to regain his composure. He realized that snapping at the witnesses had made him look unprofessional and had probably been captured on their recordings. Every mistake he made was compounding the problems this incident could create for him later. Mrs. Henderson's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it briefly. "The neighborhood watch group is asking if everything is okay over here," she announced. "I'm going to tell them that we have a respectful police officer conducting a professional traffic stop." The comment was clearly intended to encourage Rodriguez to live up to that description. It was a subtle way of reminding him that his behavior was being evaluated not just by the immediate witnesses but potentially by the broader community. Sarah understood the strategy and appreciated Mrs. Henderson's diplomatic approach. Rather than being confrontational, the neighbor was offering Rodriguez a way to be the professional officer he was supposed to be. "I think that would be accurate," Sarah said, looking directly at Rodriguez. "Officer Rodriguez has been doing his job, and I'm sure he wants to conclude this interaction professionally so we can all move on with our day." Rodriguez felt the weight of expectation from everyone present. Sarah was giving him an opportunity to end the encounter gracefully. The neighbors were encouraging him to behave professionally, and he knew that his supervisors would eventually review whatever documentation he created about this incident. The radio crackled again with another routine dispatch call, reminding him that there was real police work that needed to be done elsewhere. Standing on this street corner, prolonging a traffic stop without justification, was not serving the community or his department's mission. "Ms. Williams," he said finally, "I'm going to issue you a verbal warning about maintaining awareness of your driving patterns in residential areas." Sarah recognized that this was Rodriguez's attempt to create some official justification for the stop, even though it was essentially meaningless. A verbal warning about maintaining awareness wasn't based on any specific violation, but it allowed him to document that the stop had an official purpose. "I appreciate the reminder, Officer Rodriguez," Sarah replied diplomatically, accepting the face-saving gesture while making mental notes about the encounter for her own records. "I always try to be a careful and considerate driver." Rodriguez felt a small sense of relief that Sarah was allowing him to conclude the stop without further challenging his authority. However, he also realized that this interaction had revealed something about his own behavior that he wasn't entirely comfortable confronting. As Rodriguez walked back toward his patrol car, he felt the eyes of the neighborhood witnesses following his every move. The weight of their attention made him acutely aware that his handling of the situation would likely be discussed in the community for days, if not weeks, to come. Sarah sat in her car for a moment, gathering her thoughts before starting the engine. The encounter had lasted nearly 30 minutes, making her significantly late for her morning meeting. More importantly, it had given her first-hand experience of exactly the kind of interaction her clients regularly described in their legal consultations. Mrs. Henderson approached Sarah's car window as Rodriguez returned to his vehicle. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said quietly. "That was completely unnecessary, and I want you to know that not everyone in this neighborhood thinks that kind of behavior is acceptable." "Thank you for speaking up," Sarah replied genuinely. "It means a lot to know that community members are willing to witness these interactions and hold everyone accountable for their behavior." Tom Bradley had stopped his recording and jogged over to join the conversation. "I got the whole thing on video if you need it for anything," he offered. That officer had no reason to stop you, and it was obvious to everyone watching. Sarah appreciated the offer, but also understood that accepting the video could be seen as evidence that she was planning legal action against Rodriguez or the department. She wanted to be careful not to escalate the situation unnecessarily while also preserving her options. "I appreciate that very much," she said. "Let me give you my card in case we need to discuss this further." She handed Tom her business card, which clearly identified her as an attorney specializing in civil rights law. Tom looked at the card and his eyes widened slightly. "You're a civil rights lawyer? Man, that officer really picked the wrong person to mess with today." Rodriguez was sitting in his patrol car, trying to figure out how to write his report about the incident. Every option seemed problematic. If he was honest about having no legitimate reason for the stop, he would be admitting to harassment or racial profiling. If he fabricated a reason, he would be creating false documentation that could be challenged if the incident became the subject of legal action. His radio crackled with another call, this time requesting his response to a domestic disturbance across town. Rodriguez realized that while he had been conducting his unjustified traffic stop, real crimes were happening elsewhere that actually required police attention. "Unit 47 responding to domestic disturbance call," he radioed back, starting his engine. As he drove past Sarah's car, he caught a glimpse of her in his rearview mirror, still talking with the neighbors who had witnessed the encounter. Sarah watched Rodriguez drive away and felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that the encounter had ended without escalation, but frustration that she had been subjected to the kind of harassment that she fought against professionally every day. Her phone rang as she finally started her car. It was her law partner, Michelle, calling to check on her whereabouts. "Hey Sarah, your 9 o'clock appointment is here," Michelle said. "The Johnson family. They seem pretty nervous about telling their story." "I'm on my way," Sarah replied. "And Michelle, I think I have some first-hand insight into what they're going through that I didn't have an hour ago." As Sarah drove toward her office, she couldn't help but think about the similarities between her experience and the stories her clients told. The initial stop without justification, the fishing expedition for violations that didn't exist, the attempt to establish that she didn't belong in the neighborhood, and the officer's defensive behavior when challenged. The Johnson family had contacted her office after their teenage son was stopped by police while walking through his own neighborhood. The officers claimed he matched the description of a suspect, but when pressed for details, they couldn't provide any specific information about what crime he was supposedly connected to. When Sarah arrived at her office, she found the Johnson family waiting in the conference room. Marcus Johnson, 17 years old, sat between his parents with his head down, clearly uncomfortable about having to relive his experience. "I'm sorry I'm running late," Sarah said as she entered the room. "I actually just had an experience that might help me understand your situation better." Mrs. Johnson looked up hopefully. "You mean you've dealt with cases like this before?" "I have," Sarah replied. "But this morning I experienced something similar myself. Sometimes it takes walking in someone else's shoes to truly understand what they're going through." As Sarah listened to Marcus describe his encounter with police, she was struck by the similarities to her own experience just hours earlier. The same pattern of stopping someone without clear justification, the same attempts to establish that the person didn't belong, and the same defensive behavior when questioned about the basis for the stop. "Marcus," Sarah said gently, "what you experienced is unfortunately all too common, but I want you to know that it's not acceptable and it's not something you have to simply accept as normal." Mr. Johnson leaned forward in his chair. "We've taught Marcus to be respectful and compliant with police officers just like we were taught when we were young, but it seems like that's not enough anymore." Sarah nodded, understanding the frustration in his voice. "Respect and compliance are important for everyone's safety, but they shouldn't be required to justify your right to exist in public spaces. What happened to Marcus, and what happened to me this morning, goes beyond routine police work." Meanwhile, back at the police station, Rodriguez was struggling with his report. He had been staring at the computer screen for 20 minutes, unable to find the right words to justify his actions during the traffic stop. Sergeant Williams knocked on his office door. "Rodriguez, I need to talk to you about this morning's traffic stop on Maple Avenue." Rodriguez's stomach dropped. News about the incident had apparently already reached his supervisors, which meant it was probably more serious than he had hoped. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez said, trying to sound confident despite his growing anxiety about the conversation. "I got a call from the watch commander in that district," Sergeant Williams continued. "Apparently there were several community members who witnessed your interaction with a motorist this morning, and some questions have been raised about the justification for the stop." Rodriguez realized that his worst fears were beginning to materialize. The witnesses had apparently contacted the police department to express concerns about his behavior, which meant this incident was now officially on the radar of his supervisors. "I was conducting routine patrol duties, sir," Rodriguez said, falling back on the same vague language he had used during the stop itself. "That's what your preliminary report says," Sergeant Williams replied, holding up the brief documentation Rodriguez had submitted. "But I need more details about what specific behavior prompted you to initiate the stop. The community members who called described a very professional and cooperative motorist who didn't appear to commit any violations." Rodriguez knew he was at another decision point. He could continue to insist that his actions were justified, or he could acknowledge that he had made an error in judgment. Either choice would have consequences for his career, but one would at least allow him to maintain his integrity. Sergeant Williams closed the door to his office and sat down across from Rodriguez. The gravity of the situation was evident in his expression as he reviewed the preliminary report and the notes from the community calls they had received. "Marcus, I've been doing this job for 22 years, Sergeant Williams began, using Rodriguez's first name to signal the serious nature of their conversation. "I've seen officers make mistakes, and I've seen officers make choices that define their entire careers. Right now, you have an opportunity to tell me what really happened out there." Rodriguez felt the weight of his sergeant's experience and wisdom. He had always respected Sergeant Williams and knew that the man across from him had navigated difficult situations with integrity throughout his career. "Honestly, sir," Rodriguez said after a long pause, "I'm not sure I can give you a good explanation for why I stopped that motorist. She wasn't speeding, wasn't driving erratically, and had all her documentation in order. I think I let my assumptions guide my actions instead of actual observations." Sergeant Williams nodded slowly, appreciating Rodriguez's honesty even as he processed the implications of what had just been admitted. "Go on," he said simply. "The woman I stopped turned out to be an attorney," Rodriguez continued, his voice growing quieter. "A civil rights attorney specifically. She handled the situation with more professionalism than I did, and she made it clear that she understood exactly what was happening and why it was problematic." The revelation that the motorist was a civil rights attorney made Sergeant Williams lean back in his chair. He had seen enough police misconduct cases to understand the potential ramifications of stopping such a person without justification. "Did she indicate any intention to file a complaint or pursue legal action?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She didn't threaten anything," Rodriguez replied. "But she made it clear that she understood her rights and wouldn't be intimidated. The whole interaction was recorded by neighborhood witnesses, and she was documenting everything that happened." Back at her law office, Sarah was wrapping up her consultation with the Johnson family. The similarities between Marcus's experience and her own that morning had given her valuable insight into the psychological impact of these encounters. "What I want you to understand, Marcus," Sarah said, "is that what happened to you isn't a reflection of your character or your worth as a person. It's a reflection of flawed policing practices that we need to address systematically." Marcus looked up for the first time during the meeting. "But what if it happens again? What if next time the officer isn't willing to just let me go?" Sarah understood the fear in his question because she had felt a similar concern during her own encounter. Even as an attorney who understood her rights, she had been worried about how the situation might escalate. "We're going to file a formal complaint about your incident," Sarah explained, "and we're going to use your case to push for better training and accountability in the police department. But more immediately, we're going to make sure you understand your rights, and how to protect yourself in future encounters. Mrs. Johnson reached over and squeezed her son's hand. We're proud of you for speaking up about this, Marcus. It takes courage to challenge authority, even when you know you're right. Sarah's assistant knocked on the conference room door and entered with a message. Ms. Williams, there's a Sergeant Williams from the police department on line 2. He says it's regarding an incident from this morning. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly. She had expected there might be follow-up from the traffic stop, but she hadn't anticipated it happening so quickly. Excuse me for just a moment, she said, to the Johnson family stepping out to take the call. This is Sarah Williams, she answered, keeping her voice professional. Ms. Williams, this is Sergeant Williams with the Metropolitan Police Department. I'm calling regarding the traffic stop you were involved in this morning. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you experienced. Sarah was surprised by the proactive nature of the call. In her experience, police departments rarely reached out to apologize for problematic stops unless they were trying to prevent legal action. I appreciate you calling, Sergeant Williams, she replied carefully. May I ask what prompted this outreach? We received calls from several community members who witnessed the interaction, he explained. Based on their descriptions and Officer Rodriguez's own account, it appears the stop may not have been justified by standard police procedures. Sarah appreciated the sergeant's directness, but she was also aware that this conversation could be relevant to the Johnson case and potentially other cases she was handling. I'm glad to hear that the department takes community concerns seriously, she said. What steps are being taken to address the situation? Officer Rodriguez is going through additional training on proper procedures for traffic stops, Sergeant Williams explained. We're also reviewing our patrol practices in that neighborhood to ensure they're consistent with community policing principles. Sarah recognized that this was likely the department's attempt to address the situation internally before it became a formal complaint or lawsuit. While she appreciated the accountability measures, she also wanted to ensure that the response was meaningful rather than superficial. Sergeant Williams, I appreciate the steps you're taking, she said. However, I think it's important for you to understand that this isn't an isolated incident. I'm currently representing a family whose teenage son experienced a very similar encounter with your officers just last week. The statement hung in the air as Sergeant Williams processed its implications. One questionable stop could be attributed to an individual officer's error in judgment. Multiple similar incidents suggested a pattern that could indicate systemic problems. I'd be very interested in hearing about that case, he said after a pause. If there are patterns in our policing practices that need to be addressed, I want to make sure we're taking comprehensive action. Sarah saw an opportunity to turn her negative experience into positive change for the community. I'd be willing to meet with you and discuss not just these specific incidents, but broader concerns about police-community relations in our city. Meanwhile, Rodriguez sat in Sergeant Williams's office, waiting for his supervisor to return from the phone call. He had admitted his mistake, but he wasn't sure what consequences he would face or what steps he needed to take to rebuild his credibility as an officer. When Sergeant Williams returned, his expression was thoughtful rather than angry. That was Ms. Williams, the attorney you stopped this morning, he said. She's agreed to meet with us to discuss not just this incident but broader issues of police-community relations. Rodriguez felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Anxiety because he would have to face the person he had wronged, but relief because it sounded like there might be an opportunity for constructive dialogue rather than just punishment. What does that mean for me, sir? Rodriguez asked. It means you're going to learn from this experience, Sergeant Williams replied. You're going to participate in additional training. You're going to meet with Ms. Williams to understand the impact of your actions, and you're going to help us develop better practices to prevent similar incidents in the future. Rodriguez nodded, understanding that he was being given an opportunity to grow from his mistake, rather than simply being disciplined for it. Sir, I want you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened this morning, he said. I let my assumptions override my training, and I subjected an innocent person to harassment because of my own biases. Sergeant Williams appreciated the honesty and accountability in Rodriguez's statement. That's exactly the kind of self-awareness that can make you a better officer, he replied. The question now is what you're going to do with that awareness. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself sitting in a conference room at the police station with Sergeant Williams, Officer Rodriguez, and several other department officials. The meeting had grown from a discussion about one traffic stop into a broader conversation about police training and community relations. Ms. Williams, your insights have been invaluable in helping us understand how these encounters affect community members, Sergeant Williams said. We'd like to invite you to participate in our training program to help officers understand the legal and human impact of their actions. Sarah looked around the room, noting the genuine attention and engagement of the officers present. I'd be honored to participate, she replied. And I think Officer Rodriguez's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them sets an excellent example for others. Rodriguez felt a sense of redemption that he hadn't expected when this whole situation began. His mistake had been transformed into an opportunity for growth, both for himself and for his department. The morning that had started with an unjustified traffic stop had evolved into something much more meaningful, a genuine effort to build bridges between law enforcement and the community they served. Sarah's experience as both a victim and an advocate had created an opportunity for positive change that neither she nor Rodriguez could have anticipated. As the meeting concluded, Rodriguez approached Sarah privately. I want to personally apologize again for this morning, he said. You handled that situation with more grace and professionalism than I did, and I learned something important about myself and my job. Sarah shook his hand, recognizing the sincerity in his apology. I appreciate that, Officer Rodriguez, and I hope that our continued work together can help prevent other families from experiencing what the Johnsons went through. The transformation of a problematic police encounter into a catalyst for positive change demonstrated that even difficult situations could lead to meaningful progress when people were willing to engage honestly and work together toward solutions.